that's my bedroom window. And it's that kind of detail. So you can go by address and you can find what's there. It's amazing. Another thing about that collection that I find fascinating is the people who are in those photos. Yes, it's mostly of the buildings, but there's people in those photos. The adults know what's happening. They look very glum. They're sitting on the stoop, looking sad. They know that they're going to be displaced. Kids who are in those photos, all they know is somebody's taking a photograph. So kids, like any place else, are all jumping around and trying to make sure that their picture gets taken. So there's also a human story that's in those photographs that sometimes gets overlooked that I think is really interesting. Other observations, questions? Yes?
Excuse me, before you go, I want to add something to the gentleman's question. If they in fact lived in that block on Kenyon, I lived on 7th Street, which was the next block over, then depending on how long they lived there, they lived across the street from Big Louie's restaurant, okay? Okay.
And were they living in sin together, tell the truth?
Well, we don't know, we don't know. But it was called the Harlem Cafe, and it's now called Big Louie's. It's down there on Lynn Street by where the old Regal Theater is. But they would have lived across the street from that restaurant in the day.
Where is it now?
It's gone.
I mean, where if that street were still there and you superimpose it on the street map, the street grid that's there now, where is it?
Yeah, I'll tell you what you do. You go down 8th Street and pass, I don't know if the Choo Choo is still at a restaurant, Chattanooga Choo Choo. Yeah, well, you make a left, it'll say Carr Street. Make a left, go over to 7th Street. Make another left and go up to the end. And when you get up, it dead ends. But if you look to the right, then Kenyon would have been right over there. But they would have been at the far end, up closer to Lynn Street. Okay, Lynn and Kenyon. Mm-hmm.
When that was done, when Queensgate was done, the decision was to wipe out the street grid and create what were called super blocks. So it is difficult to sometimes put it all back together. Question up here in the front.
I wanted to know if there were other Jewish cemeteries in the West End that didn't survive the freeway construction. I bring that up because when Henry Rosenthal was making his remarks, he referred to his father bringing home a marker from a cemetery that I got the sort of the feeling was gone, which was why they had kept it.
Yeah, no, I was there when he made those remarks. I think he was referring to the Chestnut Street Cemetery. Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, that was the that was a very small. Those of you who know that famous cemetery, it's very small. It's you could walk by it and miss it, and it was really only active for about 25 years. And then the next cemetery that the Jews purchased, that was dedicated to the Jewish community, is the one that's in Walnut Hills, the one up on Montgomery and Dana, the very big cemetery. That's with all the big monuments. That began in the late 1850s. One particular man who, it's interesting, one of the two men who purchased that Chestnut Street Cemetery, one of them was a man by the name of Joseph Jonas. And Joseph Jonas, he felt that he was the first Jew in Cincinnati. Now, he wasn't the first Jew in Cincinnati, but he felt he was the first Jew, and then he lived longer than anyone else and wrote his memoirs, so he became the first Jew. And Joseph Jonas, sadly, it happens to all of us, he lived so long that he couldn't even, not only was he outlived the usefulness of the Chestnut Street Cemetery, but then he lived so long that he became feeble, and he had to go live with his relatives in Mobile. So this great Cincinnatian who was very proud of his roots and being the first Jew in Cincinnati isn't even buried in Cincinnati, but you can see his headstone if there's this project that has been undertaken on the online called Find a Grave, which is fabulous. You can find graves all over America of relatives and of famous people. But so Joseph Jonas and some of the others who were the pioneers, they ended up also in the Walnut Hills Cemetery, not in the only one of the originals that I know of that, besides Lieb, who was the one who called for the establishment, was a man by the name of David Johnson, who died in about 1840, and he is, and his family is still, I understand, has relatives here in Cincinnati to this day, the Johnson family.
Question here.
I was just curious about the statement you made about blacks following Jews. Was that literally something they did, and why?
Well, it was just Danny's, kind of salty observation about what happened, because, many of the Jewish families had long since left the West End and had moved into neighborhoods like Avondale. And then when so much of the residential core of the West End was taken out, they had to go somewhere. And so they started moving out Reading Road and settled in, Avondale. And then many Jewish people, then, particularly after the civil unrest of the 60s, moved further out into neighborhoods like Roselawn, and eventually African-American people followed them out into those neighborhoods as well. So when Danny talked about, blacks following Jews, he was simply describing what happened.
But I would like to expatiate on that if I could, because it is important to say this, that there's really two phenomena that happen with regard to the black Jewish demographic change, and this occurs in almost every major city. One part of it is definitely that as African Americans move into a community, people will leave for a variety of negative reasons. That happens. But the other, which we know and is documented, and why this happens in city after city, is because the Jewish community was almost always willing to sell or to rent or to make their housing available, whereas other communities, and this happened in many big cities, they would close arms and wouldn't sell. They wouldn't allow other strangers into their community. And it's no accident that in almost every urban area you have this blending of Jewish, and then of course Jews would often remain in the community after they left and continue their businesses. And this was again a point of connection between the African American community and the Jewish community, sometimes a very positive. We heard a wonderful story, which of course is uplifting. We could also tell lots of discouraging stories between the Jewish community and the African American community. But I think you can't just tell one side of it. The other aspect of it was the willingness to let others come in.
Let me just add one thought to that while we're on this topic, and it's not our discussion topic tonight, but the political alliance between African Americans and Jews, particularly in the middle part and the earlier part of the 20th century, is a big part of the story of progressive politics in America. And taking, if you would please, from a white goy, I would like to see that alliance recreated in our own time. I think American politics would be a lot more wholesome and productive than what we're currently getting.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, and you're exactly right. What happened when people started to move to Avondale was Jews were willing to rent properties, and some of those houses, even in Avondale, that may have been a one-family house, got broken up into 4 or 5 apartments, and everybody moving now. A lot of those black churches that are in Avondale are a couple of them are former Jewish synagogues. Yeah.
Yeah, just to reinforce, this happens in city after city across America. I think there's one other component, and that is the Jewish community was also not welcome in the broader community. So these are two groups, both of whom were out on the outs with the broader power structure in cities across America. So the fact that they had this interconnection and interrelationship is not surprising. So this is a very complex relationship. Question over here.
Yes, I was sitting here thinking about the German community. I grew up in the West End and went to Holy Trinity Church. It was a German church. And my recollection of lots of history of Cincinnati is in relationship to the Germans. They moved from the West End to over the Rhine. and St. Mary's church was occupied by the Germans that came from Holy Trinity. So I was just trying to get the understanding of the juxtaposition between the Germans and the Jews during that historical period.
Well, I can answer that, I think, and that is, I don't know if everyone's aware, but of all the different ethnic groups that come to America, starting in the 19th century today, the Irish or Polish, whatever, the German migration over the course of American history is the largest. And, of course, one of the early waves begins in the 1830s and 40s. Germans begin to come here in the 19th century, and Cincinnati explodes during this time. It becomes, from let's say 1820, a sort of a backwater little city, town really. It becomes, by of course Abraham Lincoln's election, it's the 5th or 6th largest community in America. And that huge explosion demographically is almost entirely Central European, German, Austrian, and so forth, not exclusively, but largely. And with that, in that, come German Jews.
Yeah.
And the German Jews continue to come to the city right through the 19th century, right on through until the closing of the gates for immigration in the 1920s. Of course, the people are often thrown off because the Eastern European Jews begin to come to America starting in the 1880s, and are that's an avalanche in comparison to the German Jews, that often people think the German Jews stopped coming, but they did, and they continued to come right on through. And of course, now that you're here at the Hebrew Union College, there's a great German Jewish heritage. It's in the walls here at the Hebrew Union College. If you look at all the professors on the wall, you have to know German to pronounce their names. So that's part of the answer to your story. It's a good question.
Yeah, and don't forget that so often in this city we talk about the Germans came. In the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there is no modern Germany. There's all these small German-speaking states. And people who were coming who spoke German, some were from predominantly Catholic, some were from predominantly Protestant, and they had spent centuries killing each other off. And the German-speaking Jews were just another thread of that. It's only when they all get to the United States and begin realizing one of the things they have in common is the German language, that it's like, oh, wait a minute, now in face of this other culture, we've got this other dynamic going on. So this is really a much more interesting, complex, and interesting story than it's usually told by the people during Oktoberfest.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Oktoberfest in this city is run by the organization that I work for, so I did not say that. Okay. Other questions? There's quite. Let's start. Let's go up here,
Somebody
and then we'll come back. You've already asked one, so we make sure.
You can let him ask. No, he's my brother.
Oh well.
Pull rank.
I'm just wondering, we talked about the 1948 master plan. That plan was planned prior to 1948. It was approved in 1948, correct? So it was planned maybe 10, 20 years prior to that?
Well, the formal process starts in 1943 in the sense of setting up the commission and setting the wheels in motion. But the ideas are bouncing around and being talked about long before that, yes.
It's another thing.
Hold that to your...
Oh, I'm sorry. 40,000 African Americans were shifted from the old West End farther up. The reason why I asked you about the 1948 master plan is because there's still a vestige of that plan going on now. East of Central Avenue or east of Plum Street, there are no black people or businesses that live in that area. And I think it's purposefully done. I grew up at 409 West 6th Street, right next to Abe Goldhagen's
Abraham Goldhagen, my
bar.
man.
My grandmother worked for the Kaplans, Kay's Furniture Store. David, Eugene, Stanley, the family. I, I was the first latchkey kid during those days because Mama had to be at work by 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning. So, and on one other correction. For those who are unfamiliar with the West End, if you want to go to the, on Chestnut Street to the old West Jewish Cemetery, you have to go down Central Avenue. Most of you know Central Avenue because it sits on the corner of Chestnut and Central. So that's a little easier for you to get to. On 6th Street at 6th and Central, on the east side of the street, was the market, the big market. What was it?
6th Street Market.
6th Street Market.
Yeah, we had 3.
6th Street Market. Went 3 blocks. Went from Central Avenue to Plum Street. I worked with a fellow named Richard Lewis, and I think you know him, in the Queensgate Project. That neighborhood, prior to Laura Home and Lincoln Court, as a matter of fact, the Laura Home and Lincoln Court was great for us. In the old neighborhood, we had no running water, no hot water.
No hot water.
And no bathrooms.
Right.
In about 1980, I secured a grant from the city to add warm water flats and bathrooms in some of the streets, in some of those streets around Central Avenue and Dayton Street.
Yeah.
And a lot of that neighborhood is still kind of devastated. We call it's a flat building right there at Bay Miller Street. It's still standing there vacant, and we can't do anything with it because it's tied up in legalese. But I just wanted to point a few things out for you.
Good.
I want to thank you, and
Yeah.
this is the sort of texturing that's really important. I hope you
Yeah.
write that down. And
Write it down.
I hope you record that someplace. But I would point out, it's not just the 48 master plan. The sort of systematic racial discrimination when it came to residents, it goes far beyond just the West End
Yeah.
and goes far beyond just the 1948 Metropolitan Master Plan. It's there before, and it can be documented over and over again. It's not always de jure, but it's de facto. So
Yeah.
This
And
gentleman mentioned something about the relationship between blacks and Jews. The good, the bad. Along 6th Street, there were, I'm taking too much time. Along 6th Street, there were drugstores on every corner. The drugstores from 6th Street to Mound Street. All those drugstores were had Jewish pharmacists. Each one of those pharmacists hired young black men to work in those drugstores. And like I said before, my grandmother worked for the Kaplans for years and years. So one of the good things was that the Jewish community gave black people some work, employment. The bad part of it was the salary was not too good. You know what I mean? As a matter of fact, my grandmother, after about 20 years, got fired because the federal government said you had to pay the domestics Social Security. And they didn't want to pay her Social Security. So that was the bad part. So there's good and
yeah,
bad.
it's not good, right? Yeah, let me just add about, that plan had been on the table for a long time, and it's probably Dan and others can add. It was Dwight Eisenhower who brought that plan back to the table. When he was president, they went around the United States looking at the roads in the United States, and they wanted to know if we were invaded by a foreign power, would these roads be adequate enough for us to move military and do the things that we needed to do? And they decided no. So they decided you had to build these expressways, and you had to be able to land a plane on these expressways, okay? So from that old plan sitting in the bottom drawer, it popped right back up, and there we were with cleansing the West End and moving forward.
I am actually the first native Cincinnatian in my family, and my father came down here from northern Ohio because of job opportunities. And the primary thing that he did for most of his career was work outside in heavy construction. So he was actually part of this entire freeway disaster that happened. And he tore down, or was participated in tearing down, a lot of the West End. And he was really torn about doing that, because when he would tear down these structures, they were all beautifully built. He said there was all sorts of fine walnut and oak trim, staircases, banisters, the entire thing, all throughout these places. But they, that was the job he was doing, and he couldn't do anything about it. So that's a negative aspect. But he also told me that those structures were so well built that quite often they couldn't actually tear out the basements and or the cisterns, because a lot of these structures had their own private cisterns. And they would have to fill after they punched the hole in the top with the loader or the bulldozer or whatever he was using, then they would have to fill it in with all sorts of debris, primarily from the buildings themselves. So there's probably a rich repository of artifacts and all those cisterns down through there.
There are cisterns all over the West End, and Bob Genheimer, who is an archaeologist that works at the Museum Center. The first time I met him, he was doing a dig in a cistern in the West End. I was working with Channel 12, and hi, my name's Dan. Hey, my name's Bob. And he's down there. So there's been a lot of excavation of some of those cisterns and the materials have ended up in the collections of the Museum Center. So even that has also, in some cases, been saved. Question? Yes.
This is slightly off topic, but
you're a brother-in-law, so it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
my understanding is that when the Jewish community started to emigrate out of the West End, some went to Avondale, but initially a number of them went up Price Hill.
They did.
And that explains why there are so many Jewish cemeteries in Price Hill. My question is, why did the Price Hill immigration stop?
Well, I mean, like just as today, Steve, there are quote unquote areas which are, let's say, densely populated by Jews. We might name 2 or 3 that come to our mind as the largest. There are others. I do know that was the case in the late 19th and early 20th century. For example, Isaac Wise, who originally lived on Longworth Avenue, the famous rabbi, the founder of this school, he moved to College Hill, and he had a farm there to the end of his life. So the Jews, that was an immigrant area in Price Hill, and my best guess, though this is going really beyond everything I've said up to this point, I feel I can say with certainty. This I'm sort of going out on a limb, but my intuition would tell me that it's just a matter of, up through the World War II, Steve, Jews would like to live where their residence was. They would like to live where other Jews lived. That was predominantly what it was. They might work in the community with everyone else, but they wanted to come home to where there were other Jews not exclusively, but largely. And my intuition tells me that starting in the 30s and the 40s and so forth, Price Hill was falling out of favor on the west side, and the east side, especially Amberley and so forth, becomes more and more popular, and that's what would happen. Because that the Price Hill continued to have a Jewish community actively really until the 60s and maybe 70s.
Okay, let's do one last question here, and then we're going to let people go up and really enjoy the photographs.
My question is, wow. My question is, what does the West End African American community look like had there been no Jewish community there? You know, what would it have looked like? Did anybody answer? I'm just throwing it out there. I'm just trying to imagine.
Well, it really asked the question of what was the sequence of settlement.
Yeah.
In other words, who really was there first and
Yeah.
who subsequently. I don't know if
Well,
yeah.
anybody has data.
I think we
about
have to be
that.
careful about this.
Yeah.
Go all the way back to what John started us with tonight, and that is telling the story that there were many different people in his West End as he was growing up from many different backgrounds. So often we get into saying, oh, this was a Jewish community during this time period, or this was an African American community, or it ends up sounding so uniform and absolute, and it rarely is. It's always more complex and more interesting than what those generalizations make it. So, yes, there were a significant number of Jews who lived in the West End, but there were a lot of other people who lived in the West End who, if you're just using big clumps, you could say there are lots of whites. But they would come all kinds of backgrounds. Didn't mean they were all the same. And so you